The first thing you're going to want to do is download the Mac, or if you're working with Linux, download the Linux installation of Visual Studio Code. Once you have it installed, it'll look a little something like this. And if it's a fresh installation, it'll even give you some tips and tools to actually get started. If you've never worked with Visual Studio Code before, I highly recommend going through any get started or getting instructions tips that come with opening Visual Studio Code. Additionally, we have a Visual Studio Code crash course in the GitHub repo associated with this course. Now, one of the awesome things about Visual Studio Code is it has this thing called terminals, which are command line prompts that allow us to run scripts. Basically, it's where we're going to be running all of our code. The way we can open up the terminal is we can go ahead and hit terminal and select new terminal. And you'll get something like this. Now you might have bash or zch or some other type of shell. The type that you have doesn't really matter because on Mac and Linux, it's going to be Linux based. And like I said, sometimes installing this can be the hardest part of this entire course. So don't get discouraged and please use Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange Ethereum, and the GitHub repo to move past any issues you run into. Now, if you're on Mac or Linux, you can actually hit Control backtick to actually toggle your terminal mode. This will pull the terminal up and down for you. Getting familiar with keyboard shortcuts will actually make your life a lot easier because you'll be able to move around Visual Studio Code much more effectively. We have a link to a list of keyboard shortcuts additionally in the GitHub repository associated with this section. As we move along, I'll give tips on different keyboard shortcuts that you can optionally use. Otherwise, you can just go ahead and click as well. You can click the trash can to delete the terminal, go back up, terminal, new terminal to pop it back up. Now, the next thing that we're going to need a little bit later, we're not going to need it for this section, but it's good to install it now, is going to be Git. We will have links to the installation instructions in the GitHub repository. Installing Git on Linux, you're going to use one of these two commands. And on Mac OS, if you just type Git on the command line, it should go ahead and prompt you to install it. So if we're back in our command line and we just type Git, it should prompt you to go ahead and install it. And if you do git -- version, you should get something that looks like this. You can also use a macOS Git installer by clicking this link here and running through the installation process. All right, now that you have Git and Visual Studio Code installed, we can continue on to the next section. Awesome. If you're not planning on using Windows or Gitpod, feel free to skip the next two sections.